Hello everybody and welcome to CFO Conversations. Today I have the great pleasure of welcoming back Rachel White. Thank you for joining me on today's conversation.
Thank you, Paula.
So today's conversation is around thinking differently and aspects that you might have heard of called design thinking or right to left brain thinking. And the first time I heard this was a few years ago in a conference that Simon Sinek was putting on at Sydney International Convention Centre. And he introduced the concept of thinking differently. So starting perhaps with a blank sheet of paper and working out what the answer might be if you didn't have to build it up from what you know to be true in terms of a finance team or an operations. So the way I think about it is, if we were a startup and we had the chance to start all over again without having the legacy systems that we have, how would we do it differently? Rachel, what do you think about thinking differently?
Well, Paula, let me tell you about an experience I had 7 years ago, which I think is an important piece of this whole conversation. One of the things I noticed was there was a real fear in finance professionals because we've all been taught that anything around creativity may lead to a perception of creative accounting, and we all know that that's just off the table. We are in probably the most trusted person by the board in the company in many respects. By the shareholders, and nothing that's happened in the 7 years since has changed that. If anything, that's probably become even more important. So I think for a lot of people, especially those who've been brought up in the finance profession, and we've obviously all been drilled in technical skills and the numbers have to be absolutely right and all of that sort of stuff, there's real fear around that, and I think that's important to acknowledge. Yeah. I know in the last 7 years I've learnt a vast amount about creative thinking in the terms of coming up with solutions to new problems. And I think that's probably the area I'd really like to focus on today. In terms of the way in which you think to develop those solutions, which still very much acknowledge the need for honesty and integrity and for the numbers to be rock solid and right. None of that's changed.
Yep.
And I just want to mention that at the beginning, just to acknowledge that concern. I think many finance professionals will have. It's a very valid concern. And I think today it'd be really good to talk about how to look at this in a different way where you can actually do both and harness the right side of your brain to come up with fabulous solutions for your business, for your customers, which will absolutely enhance your position in the company for which you are CFO.
That's right, and it talks again to that ever needing to change our mindset as CFOs. Yes, we're the guardian, the governance, and the rock solid foundation, but we've got to show and demonstrate that we can think differently. And I know from a finance team perspective, when I say to my finance team, well, how do you want to be an award-winning finance team? What does that look like? We know when we were studying, and still probably true today, people aren't necessarily coming out with the skill set that knows how to communicate, how to think differently, how to add value to the business. So if we're talking about business partnering, how am I actually going to do that? And I had a conversation with people in my team that were bagging out the salespeople effectively, that they were always on to us about their commissions and how do we calculate the invoices. It's like, well, have you actually sat down with them and asked what it is they need from finance? Yeah. No, I haven't. Okay, well, perhaps that's the first start. So I think it's like you say, we've not walked away from what we do and what we deliver, but we've got to think about being that business partner, thinking differently.
Absolutely. And I think the big thing that's also changed from 7 years ago is a bit like agile. Innovation and disruption are now words which are very much part of the management lexicon. Again, so I think the challenge for CFOs is to figure out, well, what does that mean both for my business but also for my finance function and the development of my people. You're only as good as your team, as we all know. And it's very easy to say, but I think in this area, encouraging that creative solutioning, let me call it creative solutioning, within your team is how you retain good people, because let's face it, finding good people is not easy. And then keeping them. There's obviously a very competitive job market out there for really talented staff. And so that's one of the ways that you keep them, and you keep them in the team, and obviously performing for you, and because for them this is how they grow, and that's in many respects, you're good people. That's what they're looking for.
That's right. And we know that that's what's going to make us look good in our jobs as well. We want good people.
And the biggest thing of that is how much space do you give them to take risks in that, obviously backing them. So with your example with the salespeople, Your team member may not get it absolutely right, but it's essential that you communicate with that sales team, you know, what it is you're trying to achieve in terms of the growth of that staff member. Often I've found, more often than not, they're delighted to come on the journey with you. They think it's great. And so because they've got no concept of any of this. And so you can actually build stronger relationships by creating the framework where your staff member can actually take risks in coming up with creative solutions, but still very much honouring that need for our just foundation of good governance. Yeah. And I've actually found the number of salespeople I've spoken to over the years, I've got a couple of lines I use, and they actually respect you for it. They really do.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is how to be a great CFO and a great leader is giving people safety, but allowing people to think differently and have creative solutions. So hopefully that's given you some food for thought. Thank you, Rachel, today.
Thank you, Paula.